Welcome to Global Connections on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about Hiroshima and the memory of it today. That memory is different in different countries. Our guest for the show is Dr. Paul Scott, Professor Emeritus, Kansai Gaidai University in Japan. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you for the invitation. It's timely that we should do this on the 80th, what will soon be the 80th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
The atomic bomb at Hiroshima was a turning point for the world, a turning point in history, as we know. And we need to study what happened there and how people remember it differently in Japan and in the United States and elsewhere, for that matter. Paul Scott has been a translator and interpreter for atomic bomb survivors in Hiroshima for the past 20 years. He speaks Japanese. It gives us a preview of the keynote he is going to present on that subject at a conference in Brazil this August, commemorating the bomb in August 1945. So, Paul, tell us how you got involved in this subject. What made you expert yourself in what happened in August of 1945 and in dealing with the survivors in Japan?
Well, I was teaching in what is called the Asian Studies program at Kansai Gaidai University in Osaka. It has one of the largest foreign student exchange programs. And we had about 450 international students, mostly American, coming to spend either a semester or a year in Japan. And I was teaching a course on modern Japanese history, my field, and I thought it was absolutely necessary that we do what would do some field work and actually get outside of the classroom. And whether it was Hiroshima is one example, where I had some contacts, and they told me, they asked me, I could come down to Hiroshima and listen to an atomic bomb survivor, but the speech would be in Japanese, and you need someone to do the translation, interpretation, and I said I would. So for 20 years, twice a year, I opened up the invitation to everyone in the Asian Studies program. So basically, I was taking about 300 students to Hiroshima, and we would. The highlight would be the atomic bomb survivor's speech. And what was important about this was the first time I did it. At the end of the person's speech, and the name of the atomic bomb survivor is Yamaoka Michiko, and she was absolutely extraordinary. She has passed away since, and she was one of the Hiroshima Maidens, which was a group of Japanese women who were sent to America for reconstructive surgery. So she was only 400 meters from ground zero. She looked up, heard the plane in the sky, looked up, and of course, when she looked up, her eyes were open, and then it was a blast, and she happened to be walking in front of a brick wall, which absorbed the blast, but not the radiation or the heat, and she survived. What was so important about her talk was, she's is just awful, because I did learn Japanese, and that's not my native language, and I know the verb to peel, for example, to peel an orange, to peel an apple, but I never thought I'd be translating this woman telling me that her skin was peeling off, and I also asked whether or not there could be a question and answer period, and the people said yes. And at the first meeting that I had, no one asked a question. And I said, "Oh my goodness, that's interesting. No questions." The next semester, then I did this. I had a whole class where I said, "Okay, we have this atomic bomb survivor. What questions? What do you think are appropriate questions? or what type of questions would you like to ask her? And I said this: the students had been prepared. They read John Hershey's Hiroshima article. They saw a documentary. We had discussions on this. They were familiar. They showed there was a Peter Jennings ABC documentary called "Why the Bomb Was Dropped." Um, so, um, so these are young students, 19, 20 years old. And someone said, I'd like to ask her how she felt about the Americans. And I said, well, that's three questions, isn't it? Before the war, during the war, and after the war. And so it was a very good learning session, not just for me, but for the students to sharpen their questions. And I said, we want to hear what happened to her. So I said, let's do a softball question. Someone has to ask her when she first ate after the atomic bomb surviving, and what type of medical treatment did she receive? And then one student named Jeremy, I still remember his name and his question, because he said, I'd like to ask her about her feelings about religion. And I said, Jeremy, I would never think of asking that question. Or maybe I would think about asking it, but I don't know if I would. I said, good, answer it. And I could tell by her response that she wasn't prepared for it. And again, for this podcast, since I teach conflict mediation and what we call peace studies as well, someone asked her what she thought of the Americans during the war. And she said, I was trained to fight the Americans. They were the enemy. After the bomb was dropped, they'd killed my family and my friends, and I hated them. And she used a verb for hate that I had learned in school. I hate. But in Japanese, you very rarely hear the verb hate. You hear the word I dislike. And she said, I hated the Americans for a long time until I realized my hatred was misplaced, that what I really hated was war. And I felt that I've used that. I'm going to use that in Sao Paulo when I go. I've used that line before. It's absolutely important, I think. So the so the question and answer period was important, and we got to listen to someone who experienced what I think would be either the worst killing day in human history, or perhaps the second. It might be the bombing of Tokyo that killed 140,000 people up to in one day, and it would be Hiroshima would be number two.
Where does Nagasaki fit in all that?
It's terrible English to say only, so I'm not going to say only, but Nagasaki might be number three at maybe 60,000 dead instantaneously. We're not talking about atomic bomb. We're not talking about radiation sickness. We're not talking about suicides. We're not talking about the secondary effects of a second generation. So how we're supposed to sort of wrap and understand how the Americans, and we like to think of ourselves as moral and correct, that we do the right thing. How they
We used to think of ourselves that way.
I I'd like to think that we still have that capacity, and how I how how we can explain, and this becomes a type of cruel mathematics. How many of them are you willing to kill to save how many of your people? And this is also with terrorism. This is with collateral damage. This is with the use of torture. So when my students came back from Hiroshima every semester, I asked them, this is after they've read literature, after they've walked through the city of Hiroshima, and I always have them get off at. They have to get off at Hiroshima Station. They take the bullet train, and if and I have them walk to Ground Zero. And Ground Zero is not on the ground. It was an airburst because that spreads the damage more. And if they were standing in Hiroshima Station on August 15th at I think 8:15 in the morning, um, roof tiles caught on fire. That's 2,000 yards away. So they're walking through a death zone. So I always ask my students the question, if you were a decision maker in 1945, August, with the information that you only had then, would you have dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I said, and this is an ungraded essay. I'm not going to grade it. And I was absolutely surprised, and still am, that almost all of the American students would say, yes, Hiroshima, but no Nagasaki.
Hmm.
So they would try to skirt around the issue that you're going to kill. Um, well, are they combatants? Are they innocent civilians? It's total war. We had been the bombing of Guernica in Spain. I Again, I have to be very careful of saying the Germans only killed less than 1,000 people, 2,000 people. And then in Rotterdam, in May of 1940, the Germans bombed Rotterdam. They only killed 2,000 people. We were horrified at that. But as the Second World War, it's amazing how during the Second World War, we the mass bombing of cities by the Allies, and that is 40,000 French civilians were killed before the invasion of Normandy.
If I could go back for a moment,
Yes.
Paul, why do the students feel that they would not have authorized the bomb for the second city, Nagasaki?
I think they might have had some misgivings about two bombings, but my European students would just said no. And I had a Chinese student. I had many Chinese students, but one in particular only wrote 3 words in her response. What about Nanjing?
Hmm.
Or Nanking or Nanjing? And I called her in after. I said, look, I'm not being critical of you. I understand your feelings, but we are talking about empathy for it's important you not lose empathy. That of course Nanjing is an atrocity, um, and the Japanese denial of it, or the arguing about numbers. And I've had Japanese students come into my office with books talking about the Nanjing massacre, and they said, "Have you read these?" I said, "Of course, I read them all." And they said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "Well, at what number isn't it a massacre?" So I said, "I'm not going to get into a numbers argument with you, and I will take the number of the victim. I'm not taking the number of the victimizer." So, so how many? I said, "I'm not going to get into that argument." So the answer surprised me because I like to think that I'm a good historian. And there is a timeline of the bombing of Hiroshima. August 6th, Hiroshima. August 9th, Nagasaki. August 15th, the Japanese surrender. So people think, and almost every documentary says this, the bombs ended the war. And I would think, well, maybe, and this is the debate, maybe they ended the war, or maybe they helped end the war, or maybe they didn't have any effect. Because in between that is the Soviet Union's entrance into the Second World War, which was agreed at Potsdam in July, that the Soviets would enter the war. They entered earlier than they had said, and the documentation on this is, some people would argue that we had already bombed about 67 Japanese cities. Tokyo, all major Japanese cities were bombed except 4, and those 4 were left as atomic bomb targets, because the language of the American military was they wanted virgin targets, targets that had no damage. So we didn't bomb Hiroshima. We didn't bomb Nagasaki. Kyoto was on the list. And Henry Simpson, 78 years old at the time, had visited. Henry Simpson was born in 1867, and he was I think he spent his honeymoon in Kyoto, and he kept on taking Kyoto off the target list, and the army kept on putting it back, and finally, at the beginning of July, he just took it off permanently. By the way, Nagasaki was then put on, and 2 other cities. So we had already bombed Japan and killed, I don't know, perhaps as many as 800,000 Japanese civilians. So to think that Hiroshima, a new bomb, of course, and that the Japanese were aware of it, the Japanese scientists, this is an atomic weapon, that this would suddenly cause the Japanese to panic and be shocked that the Americans had a new weapon, is extraordinary. There is evidence to say that the bomb was important by Japanese people at the time, and we have to be very, very careful with this, because there seems to be this causality. One thing leads to another, which leads to the surrender. And this is going back again to that cruel mathematics that I talked about. The invasion of Japan was planned for November 1st in Kyushu. And the Japanese knew where we were going to land. There are only a number of beaches that you can land on. That's why Normandy was chosen. You need a beach that doesn't have high cliffs, and goes out to a road that you can go into the interior. So I'm very careful here, because an invasion of Japan would have been horrific. It would have been horrific for the Allied troops. The beaches of Kyushu were well defended. There were millions of Japanese troops ready to fight, plus a civilian population, including my atomic bomb survivors. They were trained to fight with spears, for goodness sake. And the invasion of Kyushu, November, and then another landing off the near Tokyo in maybe March 1946. So the cruel mathematics is that it becomes a type of not moral necessity, but there's a moral question to this. It's better that we kill 140,000 Japanese, or actually 200,000 if you can include Nagasaki, and save perhaps X amount of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. And most likely, we don't know, the Soviet Union could have landed in Japan as well, and that would have been that would have changed Japanese history. And how could you have a peaceful occupation? The American occupation was extraordinarily successful because there was a surrender. So, um, what what is so important for Hiroshima is um, there's an ethical issue here.
What do the Japanese students say about whether dropping the bombs were um, justified from a moral point of view? Did they universally say no, the dropping of the bombs was not justified? What do they say, knowing all the analysis you just gave us?
Many, if not, I'm not sure about all, but many Japanese students, as class trips, go to Hiroshima and visit the atomic bomb museum and listen to the atomic bomb survivor. So, again, we have to be really careful with this because Pew, the opinion research group, in 1945, over 90% of Americans approved of that bombing. That has come down to about 59%. But for Japan, it's just remained constant. More than a majority, almost 80% of Japanese feel that it wasn't justified. Justified on moral grounds, and also it's more than just morality. It is would Japan have surrendered without the atomic bombs? Were they necessary? And this is something that we can prove that Japan was certainly defeated, but how close to surrender it was. And this is the problem with Hiroshima, is the impatience of the decision makers and the amount of information um, that the key bureaucrats made, and that's Truman and his advisors, that how well informed they were before they're making this momentous decision. They Truman was in office. Truman was vice president for 81 days. He was selected by the Democratic Party. They wanted him. Roosevelt wanted James Burns, but he didn't get the nomination because he was he's just an avowed racist.
How much of the American sensibility at the time was based on racism?
I think 100%. John Dower has written a wonderful book about that the American soldier and the American public could separate the average the average German soldier. They could identify that the average German soldier, not the SS, the average German soldier was most likely very similar to the American soldier. But in Japan, that the Japanese soldier would not surrender, was fanatical. The code of Bushido, the samurai, the atrocities, whether it's the Bataan Death March or the treatment of prisoners, the Nanjing Massacre before that, is very real. Is very real. And the last year of that, no one knows. See, that's so I'm a good historian. No one knows at the time whether it's the last year of the war. When was that war? How would that war end? And it's easy to start a war. It's really hard to end one.
You talk about the calculus on sending American troops for an on the beach invasion such as Normandy. But could the United States have simply stayed offshore and not tried to invade Japan? There had been all this bombing, conventional bombing by the US and Russians. Couldn't they just stay offshore and wait for it to dissipate, wait for the effects of their conventional bombings to take hold of Japan's economy and civil society? Did they really think they had to invade?
If there was not a surrender, But the point is, how do you get them to surrender? And this is the perhaps the wrong. Well, is this the wrong lesson of Hiroshima? There's a there is a U.S. military doctrine called shock and awe, and there is a book with that, and they use Hiroshima as an example. So it's not so in how much did we know about what Japan's intentions were from a diabolical enemy because of Pearl Harbor, a distrustful enemy, a really demonic other enemy. They're Asian. Uh, how could we enter into a dialogue with that government and with clarity? And our intelligence people, and one of them being the former ambassador to Japan, said, President Roosevelt talked about unconditional surrender, and the Japanese could not accept an unconditional surrender without a guarantee of what would happen to the emperor and the imperial house of Japan. And our intelligence people and others, it's very interesting what Eisenhower felt of the bomb, unnecessary. It's interesting what MacArthur felt, unnecessary. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called it that fool weapon. That what we had to do, and this is political as well, we just had to be clear on terms and conditions to be decided later. I'm almost quoting the document. We're not going to touch the imperial throne will be left. Well, I don't want to say intact, but we're not going to try the emperor as a war criminal and shoot him.
Mm.
And that alone, people would say was the deciding factor. And this is everyone in Washington knew it. And then we have this idea that we had spent $2 billion, that's 1945 money, in building this weapon. And we built the weapon because we were afraid of Germany. And this is where my calculus on a personal level, on a moral level, would I have dropped this on Nazi Germany if I knew that they were on the verge of developing a nuclear weapon? Of course I would have. Because I'm literally saving Western civilization. We can't let those bastards win.
There's been discussion about FDR,
Yes.
and had he lived, query whether he would have dropped the bomb. You have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think illness and age and access to information, and actually if I want to raise the blood pressure of an intelligence officer, and I talk to these people, okay, and I was in Afghanistan twice, and I talk about intelligence failures, and they get almost red in the face. They say, "We have the information, and we pass it up, and it gets rejected or politicized and changed." So it's who's briefing the president, and how accurate their information is, and what their agenda is. And Truman. What his stock is among historians or people who judge the U.S. presidency has gone up. But I would think the early Truman, he met with Roosevelt twice as vice president, once for lunch, and once another meeting. There was no policy discussed. He knew nothing about the atomic weapons, nothing, and he was briefed by Henry Stimson, who was 78. And, this is someone in 1945 that's 78. We're not talking about 2025. I'm in my early 70s. I don't feel, I don't feel aged and decrepit, but there's Stimson wasn't that clear on his messaging to Truman. And it seems that Truman wasn't really clear. He said, oh, we have to drop this where there are troops and workers' housing. And um, um, the military dropped it in the center of the city, not touching the military facilities, which were the docks. Hiroshima is a port city, and they dropped it in the center of the city to study its blast effects. And so after Nagasaki, Truman in his diary said, "I don't want to kill any more women and children." After
Afterward. Yeah.
afterwards. So there is in this, this battle for this is after the event, because even before Hiroshima, the scientists in New Mexico, in Los Alamos, uh, many of them refugees from Europe, um, many of them completely aware of what was happening in Europe. And it's Leo Szilard, a Hungarian, brilliant man, and Einstein, who was not involved in the atomic bomb project. They wrote a letter to Roosevelt. They wrote a letter to Roosevelt because they had left Germany and they knew how good their students were. And stupid Hitler, uh, got rid of his Jewish physicists, got rid of them. They stripped them of their positions, and thought that physics, nuclear physics, was some type of Jewish science. But the people that were trained by these brilliant scientists who went to New Mexico, they knew that Germany was capable. So the letter was sent, and the Manhattan Project began. And anyone who was anyone in physics was got a phone call, and suddenly is in the middle of New Mexico. And they felt, honestly, all of them, I could say that without equivocation, that all of them felt they were saving Western civilization from a Nazi atomic weapon. Because if the Nazis would have developed one first, they would have won the war.
What about Oppenheimer? How did he feel? What about Einstein? How did he feel? There was a movie about this,
Yeah.
remember?
Well, yeah, I watched the movie twice, and I wrote a very long review of the movie. There was a letter that Leo Szilard authored, signed by many of the scientists, saying they wanted to do exactly what you said. Let's demonstrate the bomb. Let's explode it over a purely military target or have a demonstration effect, but don't drop it on a a defenseless city, an unarmed city.
There's a statement in that. But I wanted to go back for a minute and ask you about people other than the witnesses that you talked to. That as a historian, you'll agree with me that history is told by the survivors.
Yes.
And it's so difficult to get into the minds of those who died and try to relive or understand their experience in the moment. But your interviews and your interpretation of what they were saying to you probably helps you do that. What was it like walking down the street in Hiroshima or Nagasaki when you looked up at that flash in the sky? What would it be like today if the bomb was dropped somewhere? What would that experience be for those who didn't survive?
Well, this is where memory comes into play, because I don't care what language you're speaking or reading, what language can transmit that type of horror. Language. Um, even when someone, an atomic bomb survivor, Miss Yamaoka, for example, whose eyelids were burnt off when she looked up in the sky, who shows you, I put my arm up, who shows you her scars from the heat on her legs, just like an Auschwitz survivor. They always show you their numbers. And I haven't been to Auschwitz, because I like to sleep at night. Um, no, to be honest, it's just too horrible. Uh, the Nazis were very methodical, and at Auschwitz you have. See, this is what's so interesting about your question. You have a room full of eyeglasses, a room full of wooden legs, a room full of wedding rings, and behind every one of those objects is a person. And this is where the Diary of Anne Frank is important too, because it's just one teenage girl, but actually there are a million teenage girls. How can I comprehend a million children being massacred, killed? They're murdered. They're not. They're not. They're murdered. And they're murdered by people. This is what separates Auschwitz from Hiroshima. They're murdered by people who push them into the gas chamber day after day. And that is beyond my imagination. It's going into Dante's hell every day. These men are doing this. For Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we did it twice. And I think justifying it is wrong. I think that's where we lose our morality. Um, I think justifying it is wrong. And I understand the emotional impact of a veteran saying, and it's factual, that if they would have invaded, the bomb saved their lives.
Well,
It's emotional, but it's not factual because the invasion didn't take place. Now, why the invasion didn't take place, that's the swamp of interpretation.
the human condition. Somehow the human condition is all over this: humanity, emotions, irrationality. And I wanted to ask you, as an historian, you've studied atrocities, obviously, in World War
Yes.
II and elsewhere. And atrocities have a special place in human history and in the 20th century and now in the 21st also. And there are these threats of nuclear warfare coming from hither and yon. There are too many members of the nuclear club, and they make these threats, or we perceive that they may use that technology to do what happened in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or worse. And I wonder what your thoughts are about whether people do have a memory of what happened in August of 1945, whether they see this clearly through the lens of history, to imagine what would happen to them and us and anyone who was victimized by one of these bombs. Um, do they know? Do they understand? Is the world numb to this? Is the world aware and awake of what would happen if someone dropped a bomb?
Well, we live in a post-truth world, made possible by social media, and you can always find someone that will believe that the Earth is flat. 34 or 35% of people in Great Britain, believe that the Americans did not land on the moon, and that's after social media. You you find people accepting that the bombs ended the war, and I would like it, and that takes the burden off, or the moral burden off the American government and the American people, because not the American people, because um, on the August 31st issue of the New Yorker, John Hersey, um, the August 31st, 1946 edition of the New Yorker was entitled Hiroshima. And the whole issue was devoted to John Hersey, who went to Hiroshima and talked about and interviewed and talked about 6 survivors. He talked about the other side of the bomb site. He humanized what we had done. And American public opinion, whatever you think of the New Yorker and who their audience is, which is another discussion, I always think it's in elite New York doctors' offices. But the American people, whether they're from New York or Kansas, they began to question, was this really necessary? And because they began to question it, Truman asked Henry Stimson, 79 years old at the time, whether he would write an article justifying the attack. And that was published in 1947 in Harper's Magazine. And he said that it was um, it was necessary because it saved 1 million lives, and we would have to have invaded Japan. And he said it was a moral decision because look what the invasion would have cost the Japanese and the Americans, and that's sort of tampered down. Uh, Gee, did we really have to do this? And then, of course, you have the Cold War, and then you have the Russians get their first nuclear weapon in 1949, and the Chinese in 1964. And now we have a whole, and I studied this in graduate school, then we have a whole idea that of deterrence. And I have a nuclear weapon. If don't hit me, I'll hit you back. What's deterrence? Um, if you hit me, I'll hit you 10 times back and harder. So that gives me, that makes me feel very uncomfortable because we haven't used a nuclear weapon since 1945. And if you would have told me that in 1945, which I wasn't born yet, that we're going to go the next 80 years and no one's going to use a nuclear weapon. And the lesson there may be you can have a nuclear weapon, but you can't use one.
The guns of August. Remember Barbara
Yes.
Tuchman at
Yes.
Columbia? The guns of August. And what she said was, if you arm Europe and everyone, builds weapons and makes war plans, it's inevitable. It's irresistible
That's
that
right.
one day something will set it off. And then there was World War I. And so I ask you then this: if we have all these countries with nuclear weapons, all of whom could achieve Hiroshima or much worse with modern nuclear weapons, how close are we? This whole thing about deterrence sort of doesn't ring true. The Barbara Tuchman approach would be, it's not really deterrence, it's getting ready for war.
Well,
where do you stand on that?
well, this is classic Latin Roman expression. If you want peace, prepare for war. It's called Passum Bellum in Latin, to show you my Jesuit education. But I would change that. If you want peace, prepare for peace. No, it's serious. And there's a whole literature on which I read. Other people should read it as well, of inadvertent escalation. No one, Barbara Tuchman, the Guns of August, no one was thinking there was going to be a war that would last 4 years and claim 9 million lives and end with the end of at least three empires: the Ottoman Empire, the German Empire, and the Russian Empire. And no, it starts off very small, and exactly what you said, which is what I would call inertia. And this is Hiroshima. The Manhattan Project is started, it's funded, there's a race to build the bomb, the crews are trained, the targets are selected, the B-29 is developed to carry this weapon. You drop the bomb. So so that's your question, is so interesting. And plus the bombing of civilian cities and the killing of civilians, then more civilians were killed in Second World War than combatants. So who's going to push that back, that inertia towards we have to use them? And that's where your question is. Maybe Roosevelt, if he was healthy and he had the energy to push back. Stimson did not. He sent out mixed messages. Where he understood the gravity of the bomb, but he didn't push back. Truman was ill-informed.
But Paul, we're living in the same kind of inertia now, aren't we? We talk about it so much, and countries that have the bomb talk about using the bomb for leverage, for threat, for war. And my final area of inquiry with you is this: if some country, some irrational leader Take, for example, Kim Jong-un, just for example, dropped a bomb somewhere. There would be, may I say, a chain reaction, perhaps. First, the city that he dropped it on would be destroyed, or worse, maybe the country would be destroyed, the economy of the country, the society of the country. But then there might be more chain reaction. Other people, other countries would do it too. And before you know it, you'd have a global conflagration. That's my view of it, but I wonder what your view of it is. If somebody dropped the bomb today, what would happen, both in the area where the bomb dropped and beyond?
Well, then you have to get the person that drops it would do it either as a suicide move or with some thought of survivability. And this is where, and again, I've studied this. This is where, if I have 1,000 nuclear weapons and you have 1,000, let's say, just for, I don't want to do the real numbers on what the Soviet Union and the US have. And let's say they're on Trident submarines and they're in missiles, and you have 1,000 and I have 1,000. Okay, who fires first and how many? And the answer is, and then do you fire all of them? Do you fire 10 of them? What's your targets? Is it cities? Is it tactical? Is it strategic? And then what if they survive and they have a second strike? And so the answer is we could never work out between the superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. Not that the Cuban Missile Crisis couldn't have caused a nuclear exchange. Um, so to do this sort of massive apocalyptic nuclear war, for North Korea to even launch well, I had talks with a U.S. Air Force officer he said, look, if North Korea attacks the South, we will vaporize them. So the Kim dynasty, he wants North Korea to, what's his purpose? To, to, to stay in power. And that's the stupidity of Saddam Hussein. He just had to have the inspectors. He what was so he caused the war by his stupidity. So the idea of India and Pakistan both having nuclear weapons and being very emotional about Kashmir, and it's a Hindu-Muslim religious issue as well, that will be localized and horrific. I mean, millions. I've been to Pakistan and Afghanistan, Pakistan and India. The cities are enormous. Um, uh, Pakistan would be destroyed.
What message, what frame of mind would you leave with our viewers today? And I suppose I'm also asking, what frame of mind would you leave with your audience in Brazil later this year in August?
I think what they should take away is, if they can afford it, go to Japan, go to Hiroshima, get off at Hiroshima Station, and walk to ground zero. And think that you're walking through a zone of death. And that's only 15 kilograms. And this is the reality. This is not Hollywood. This is not some video game. And 100, I'm not even, the figures for Hiroshima, these people are, I use the word vaporized. We have pictures of just the shadow of people walking across a bridge. We just have an image of them. They're completely vaporized. And the number of orphans that are left behind because their parents are both killed in Hiroshima. And to transfer, this is not someone with an automatic weapon in a school or in a McDonald's. Those weapons work, and they cause a tremendous amount of damage in seconds. No, you don't have I don't have the mental ability to think of really what an atomic explosion does. Um, um, uh, it is a. This is where I have to be careful that if it's a terror weapon, In other words, out of World War II, we're going to bring the Japanese government to the negotiating table by demonstrating on 2 Japanese cities targeted for that purpose that we can incinerate most of a city in 1 second. Surrender.
You mentioned that there were 3 areas of time where you wanted to know how the Japanese felt about the bomb, mm, or rather how the yeah how the Japanese felt about the Americans. They were trained to fight the Americans. They hated the Americans after the bomb, but now it's not like that anymore. What is it like now, and why? Why have the Japanese forgiven us if they have?
Well, forgiven is an interesting is interesting. It's losers, whether they're German women that were raped in Berlin when the Russians took Berlin in April and May of 1945. The victims always don't have a voice or feel they have a voice. And the voice of the atomic bomb survivors was often suppressed. Um, and someone from that World War II generation could easily say, with some cause, when you talk about Hiroshima, they would say, what about Pearl Harbor? And you started it, we'll end it. And you've heard this, and people talking about this. And the American approach to war has always been we go before the Second World War, as you go in unprepared, then you're dragged into the war. You have to demonize your enemy, objectify them, demonize them, exterminate them, women and children, and then you bring the world back to peace. And people were celebrating peace. And a research project that I did on this was right after Hiroshima. How many editorials questioned the bombing? And I could find 2. One from a Vatican newspaper who questioned the morality, and if it doesn't come from the Vatican, that's okay. And I'm not a Catholic. And the second is Albert Camus, writing in his the day after Hiroshima, saying this is absolutely awful. The state of civilization. We shouldn't be celebrating this. And what would I be celebrating? I'd be if I were 20 years old, and my father and my mother and all of my uncles were in the Second World War, and my father told me that when he left San Francisco on a troop ship, I don't think 1943, he said he never thought he would survive the Second World War. And suddenly you wake up on August 16th or August 15th, and you're a Japanese, and you're not going to die. You have the Americans are coming. We're not sure what the Americans are going to do, but the war is over, and they've been fighting since 1937. By the way, with 600,000 Japanese dead in China, so there's casualties there, and 3.1 million Japanese altogether in the Second World War. So you wake up and you have a life. So that Hiroshima, okay, the bombs weren't necessary, but the war ended. It may have contributed to that, and let's move on. People like us who are saying, there are deeper questions here. We shouldn't move on. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And there were real lessons about accurate information to decision makers, how well informed they are, whether it's in a democracy or what is Putin thinking What type of information is he getting? Uh, uh, I don't read. I have Russian students, and it's Ukraine's hardly on the front pages. So it's information. So I think we need accurate information. I don't want to tell veterans to stop saying the war, say the Hiroshima saved their lives, because emotionally that's correct, and there is a possibility that there would be an invasion. So I would rather to say you have three choices: the bomb ended the war, it didn't end the war, or it contributed to ending. And then you have the mainstream American interpretation: the bombs ended the war. You have a revisionist interpretation, which said they didn't end the war. The Russians coming in ended the war. And then you have some other evidence that say, the bombs weren't needed. But we don't know. We don't know. I don't know.
But clearly, we should all of us, study history, especially people in political office. We need to know what happened before, or we will be doomed to repeat it.
Absolutely. And there's a Japanese, interesting when I said the language wasn't incapable, there's a Japanese anime that I never, I'm not I'm not a fan of, and like I love anime, but the anime of these people being blown apart by the bomb is it transmits uh, an imagery that I think Hollywood can't do.
Yeah,
I mean, what's the most brutal World War II film to come out of Hollywood? Saving Private.
yeah. That's another show how war is glorified in so much of
That's right, and
Hollywood.
it's a very classic sort of John Ford, the gruff sergeant and the brilliant officer, and you have to have an Italian and a Jewish American, and you have to have your squad.
The Greatest Generation, commemorating the Greatest Generation, and glorifying war. And if you look at most of those dark movies on cable now today, there's so many of them that are filled with violence, filled with war, and you wonder whether those kids who should be educated in history rather than violence, you wonder what message they're getting.
It is, the bombs in the center of the city, and the yards or the meters. I have the Pew Public Opinion poll on what done in 2015 on what the Japanese and Americans do they think the bombs were justified. I have a picture taken by an American photographer in Nagasaki. It's a young man standing with his dead brother on his back in front of a crematorium. I'm not sure if it's Pulitzer Prize winning, but anyone who looks at Hiroshima and Nagasaki knows about this picture.
Paul, we're gonna have to leave it there, Paul. Thank you so much to our guest, Paul Scott, Professor Emeritus, Kansai Gaidai University in Japan. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Global Connections, and we've been discussing Hiroshima and the memory of it today. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha. Aloha, Paul.
Aloha, Jay. Thank you very much for the invitation.